There comes a point after a deep inner opening when ordinary life begins to return, not in the old way, not as something you have to force yourself back into, but as something that has quietly been here all along. You may be sitting in a quiet room, driving through familiar streets, making coffee, answering a message, hearing the same sounds of daily life around you. And yet something has changed. The world has not disappeared. The tasks are still there. The conversations are still there. The small human responsibilities are still there. But the way life is held inside you is no longer the same. For a while, inner depth and ordinary life may have felt like two separate worlds. One felt silent, vast, almost impossible to explain. The other was full of movement, decisions, duties, relationships, and ordinary concerns. But slowly, the need to choose between them begins to fade. Life does not have to be rejected for depth to remain, and depth does not have to become a place where life is left behind. From this point, the journey does not end. It only changes its nature. Awareness continues to widen, but it does not always widen in the same way it did at the beginning. The first opening may have been intense. It may have broken something open in the body and mind. It may have felt like a shock, a collapse, a sudden crack in the structure of the self. But after the emptiness has been seen more clearly, after the mind has learned, even partially, not to cling to light, not to fight the dark, and not to build a story around every inner movement, the next openings may become deeper without becoming louder. The shift is still real, but it does not always need to become dramatic. Sometimes the deepest changes do not arrive as emotional peaks. They do not shake the body. They do not create a spiritual event that can easily be remembered and described. They move quietly. A layer of identification loosens. A subtle attachment is seen. A familiar inner reflex no longer carries the same force, and because there is less noise around it, the movement may actually be clearer than the first opening. Experience comes. It opens what it needs to open. It completes its work. Then it fades. What remains is not the story of the experience. What remains is a wider, quieter, more transparent field of awareness. There is still formation. There are still insights, inner movements, moments of clarity, and temporary ways the mind gathers meaning. But their nature begins to change. They are no longer mainly there to strengthen an image of oneself. I have seen something. I am different now. I am deeper than before. That kind of identity may still appear, but it becomes easier to recognize. Understanding can arise without turning into pride. Depth can unfold without becoming a self-image. Clarity can come without being turned into a new spiritual identity. Formation becomes temporary, a tool, a doorway, a movement that serves its purpose, then dissolves when its work is done. This is one of the quiet signs that the journey has matured. Not that nothing appears anymore, but that what appears is no longer so quickly turned into me. The journey continues like a natural current within awareness. It is no longer driven in the same way by anxious seeking. The movement toward light is not merely a desire of the will. It becomes a deeper inclination of the whole being. A quiet steadiness appears, not the discipline of forcing yourself toward a spiritual ideal, but the steadiness that comes when the old attractions no longer have the same power. This depth begins to show itself in ordinary life. A single word, a small conflict, a passing emotion, or a simple choice can now be seen at a deeper level. What used to be just a reaction becomes a doorway. What used to be irritation, fear, desire, or disappointment begins to reveal the structure behind it. And in meditation, contemplation, silence, prayer, self-inquiry, or any form of inner practice, the purpose also becomes more subtle. Practice is no longer mainly a way to create a special feeling for the self to collect. It becomes a space where awareness can turn toward what is true. The deeper it is, the less it needs to announce itself. The more real it is, the less it needs to be proven. Still, this does not mean the path becomes a flat, peaceful line. Old residues of darkness may still remain. After a long period of stillness, a wave of struggle can return. After a very clear opening, there may still be a brief collapse. After a genuine deepening, An old pattern may come back in a form you did not expect. But this does not always mean regression. The path often moves in a spiral. Something returns, but not always in the same way. Sometimes the same pattern appears at a deeper level, in a subtler form, so it can be seen more precisely. Sometimes a darkness that seemed to be gone comes back, not to deny the light, but so the part of it that remains can be brought into the light. When this spiral nature is understood, the returning waves can be met with more calm. They do not need to be spiritualized. They do not need to be feared, and they do not need to be interpreted as failure. The path is not moving backward. Awareness is learning to see what has not yet been fully seen. From here, it becomes possible to look more deeply into the nature of emptiness itself. At one level, what we call emptiness is often created through contrast inside the mind. The mind once lived inside a dense world of somethingness: identity, story, meaning, ambition, control, achievement, memory, and the constant need to grasp. When that world begins to break, the absence of it appears as emptiness. The more solid the old something once felt, the more vast the nothing appears afterward. The denser the old identity was, the more hollow the space feels when it falls away. The more the self had built its ground upon what could be held, named, and known, the more unfamiliar this open space becomes. But this is the key point. This emptiness is not yet true emptiness if the mind is still shaping it, naming it, and holding on to it. It is still a state. It is still an inner place. It is still a kind of landscape built through contrast. It is the emptiness that stands opposite to fullness, and because of that, it still belongs to the same divided movement of the mind. The mind may no longer cling to the old objects. It may no longer build itself through success, recognition, possession, or a familiar life story, but it can still cling to emptiness. It can still build an identity out of being in a special inner space. It can feel quietly superior because it has touched a void that others seem not to understand. It can reject ordinary life and call that rejection freedom. It can mistake distance for liberation. In that case, the form has changed, but the movement of the mind is still the same. It no longer clings to something. It clings to nothing. It no longer builds the self out of worldly achievement. It builds the self out of spiritual absence. And when that happens, the mind is still standing inside itself. This is why emptiness is both dangerous and precious. It can become another identity, or it can become the place where identity is finally seen more clearly. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And this points directly to what the void is really asking of us: not to worship the light, not to escape into emptiness, not to build a new identity around being more awake than others, but to see what is still hidden, to see the attachment that remains, to see the fear that still moves beneath the surface, to see the subtle self that can even use emptiness as a way to survive. Only then does the void become something more than absence. It becomes a field where the mind can finally see itself. This is the great value of the void. It gives the mind a chance to see what remains of itself. In the world of somethingness, the mind is seen through its attachment to objects, achievements, meaning, relationships, and control. In the world of nothingness, the mind is seen through its attachment to emptiness, negation, uncertainty, and even through its hidden desire to return to what once felt solid. Both sides reveal the same deeper mechanism. The mind creates, the mind divides, the mind clings. It clings to having. It clings to not having. It clings to meaning. It clings to meaninglessness. And sometimes, it clings to the image of someone who has passed through emptiness. The void becomes a field where these movements can finally be seen. Not only the stories of the past, not only the wounds, desires, fears, and losses that once filled the self, but the very way the mind creates something and nothing, then tries to stand on one side as if that side were absolute. When this understanding becomes deep enough, both something and nothing begin to lose their absolute power. Life does not need to be denied, but emptiness does not need to be worshipped. Experience does not need to be grasped, But the absence of experience does not need to be grasped either. When both sides lose their authority, a different kind of openness begins to reveal itself. This is not emptiness as the opposite of life. It is not a blank inner state after the old world has collapsed. It is not a spiritual territory the mind can own. True emptiness is the open field of awareness in which things can arise and disappear without being hardened into self. A thought comes, a feeling comes, a memory comes, a relationship, a task, a joy, a disappointment, a silence, a loss. All of it can appear, all of it can pass, and none of it has to become the center of identity. This is not cold detachment. It is openness without possession. This is why the void, even when it is painful, unstable, and full of inner struggle, carries a value that no other stage of the journey can replace. It is the environment where the heart begins to move toward openness. Not openness as a state that has to be manufactured, but as the natural movement that appears when what is closed begins to be seen and no longer held so tightly. It is also the environment where intelligence begins to turn toward light, not light as an ideal to chase, but as the natural direction of awareness when it is no longer pulled backward by what remains unseen. In this field, the heart and the mind begin to work together in a different way. Old knots can gradually be met. Life can be entered again, not as a fall from depth, but as the living ground where depth expresses itself. And the next steps of the journey can become possible without needing to stop and build a new self out of what has been understood. This is a very quiet transformation. And because it is quiet, it is easy to miss. The deepest change does not always happen at the level of experience. It happens at the foundation of what we call self. The self does not simply disappear, it transforms. At first, it may have been a contracted self, always returning to itself, taking itself as the center and boundary of every experience. Everything was interpreted in relation to me, my pain, my awakening, my emptiness, my progress, my fear, my meaning. But slowly this sense of self becomes wider, less rigid, less defensive, less certain of its own boundaries. It becomes so open that the line between me and not me begins to lose its old sharpness. Not because the mind is confused, but because that line was never as solid as the mind believed. The self becomes transparent. It can function in life. It can speak, choose, respond, work, love, and care. But it is no longer experienced as the final center of reality. It is no longer the owner of everything that appears. And at the far edge of this widening, not as a goal to be chased, but as the natural direction of a journey that continues, even the self begins to fall away. Not through violence, not through rejection, not through the fantasy of destroying oneself, but through the softening of the final boundary between awareness and what is being known. What remains is not a person who possesses emptiness, not a self that has become spiritual, not an identity that has successfully crossed the void. What remains is a field of knowing in which life can appear without being turned into a separate center. The ordinary world is still here. The sounds, the rooms, the streets, the faces, the unfinished tasks, the small human moments. But they are no longer held in quite the same way. Life is no longer outside the depth, and depth is no longer elsewhere. This is what the void has been pointing toward all along.